Okay, welcome. I will be discussing my book, Dixie's Italians, Sicilians, Race, and Citizenship in the Jim Crow Gulf South, which was just published by LSU Press this past April 2020. And I am very excited to be here today since my plans to discuss my book live and to present about my book at several conferences have unfortunately been foiled. So I'm eager to have the opportunity to talk about my book virtually. This is my first time doing a Facebook Live, so thank you in advance for your time and patience. Special thank you to my editors at LSU Press, Rand Dodson and Catherine Cater, and thank you to LB Kovac for putting on this remote reading series. So my plan for the next half hour is to begin with a brief introduction of my book and then offer some selected readings from the book, and then I will open it up to questions. So if you are just joining us, I am Jessica Barbata Jackson, here to talk to you today about my book, Dixie's Italians, Sicilians, Race, and Citizenship in the Jim Crow Gulf South. I do want to just talk about the cover really briefly. This is a 1905 colorized postcard of a Sicilian fruit stand in New Orleans. So notice among the bananas, a Sicilian family, there's a dog, several children, and even a patron of color in this image, which speaks to some of the themes in the book. So this book began as a dissertation, special thanks to my mentors and colleagues at UC Santa Cruz. And when I began my graduate work, I was also a high school history teacher. And I had always been fascinated with immigration history. This was a story of cyclicality that seemed to repeat itself as various immigrant groups immigrated to the US, and where European immigrants were subjected to a particular racial experience. Irish, Jewish, Italian immigrants, initially discriminated against, but who then advanced socially and racially and eventually joined the white mainstream. They, quote unquote, became white, so to speak. And I used to teach an article to my high school students about how the Jews became white. And I began this project thinking that I would write the seminal work on how the Italians became white. I quickly realized that much ink had already been spilled on this topic, and I credit those scholars with providing a very rich historiographical foundation for my work. At the time that I began my research, I happened to be reading several books about the history of early New Orleans, and what I soon learned was I was reading several books about the history of early New Orleans, and I stumbled across this lynching, a lynching of 11 Sicilians in 1891 New Orleans. What I soon learned was considered one of the largest mass lynchings in US history. So what immediately struck me was that even as a US history teacher, this was an event that I was unfamiliar with, and one that was not more well known. So I began delving into these various histories in order to better bring them together. Immigration history with Southern Louisiana history, with the history of modern Italy and Italian immigrants, and the history of race. And this was a history with many layers. There was a complicated, more fluid racial structure in 19th century New Orleans, at a time when Southern states were beginning to impose Jim Crow segregation laws, largely articulated in terms of black and white, at a time when new Southern and Eastern European immigrants were beginning to arrive in the US and were considered, racially speaking, somewhere in between. And then specifically bringing this massive migration of Sicilians and Southern Italians into this story, who were emigrating en masse largely in response to Italian unification and the establishment of the Italian Republic. These immigrants didn't speak Italian, much less identify as Italian themselves. So these Sicilian and Southern Italian immigrants, who were recruited to replace enslaved laborers on Southern plantations, were loaded onto citrus fleets due to the existing citrus trade between Palermo, Sicily, and New Orleans. They arrived in the South with a complicated sense of place and identity, and this meant that immigration history, which is usually told through the lens of the urban North, was also a story of the South, a story of Louisiana, a complex story of race, and a story that needed to be told. So initially, I started with the 1891 lynching, and I was hoping to find the why. Why were Italians lynched? Why were Italians the only European ethnic group to have been lynched in large numbers? What I found was more complicated. While Italians were lynched in the South, they were initially welcomed to the region in the 1870s and 1880s as, quote, proper citizens, and they were offered certain legal privileges of whiteness. So I began asking, how could Sicilians and Italians be considered foreign white voters, but also susceptible to lynching? How could Italians fall both outside white supremacy's understanding of whiteness and also within it? How would Italians be classified? And how would they position themselves as Southern states began imposing Jim Crow laws like voting restrictions and interracial marriage bans? Could they vote? Where did they go to school? And who did they marry? And what I found was complex. Italian immigrants' right to vote was protected in 1898 Louisiana, while their children were prevented from attending white schools in Mississippi in 1907. Sometimes Italians secured official marriage licenses to marry partners of color, while other times those unions were considered to violate the state's miscegenation statutes or interracial marriage bans in Louisiana and Alabama. So in this book, I tell the story that moves from 1870s Louisiana through 1920s Alabama, and each chapter centers on a particular case study. So the first chapter offers an overview of the transnational history of the Italian and Sicilian diaspora in the Gulf South, and shows that the Southern experience of Sicilian and other Italian immigrants, in contrast to their experience in the urban North, was originally characterized by a more positive relationship with native-born Southerners. The second chapter uses the 1891 mass lynching of 11 Italians in New Orleans as the primary case study, but it also addresses the other lynchings of Sicilians and other Italians across Louisiana and Mississippi between the 1880s and 1910s. Chapter 3 focuses on the 1898 Constitutional Convention in Louisiana and chronicles the passage of Louisiana's, quote, privilege Dago clause, which actually worked to protect Italian voting rights over those of African Americans. Chapter 4 uses 1907 Summerall, Mississippi as a central incident and investigates the efforts to segregate Sicilian children from local white schools. And Chapter 5 uses a relatively infamous Alabama Supreme Court case, Rollins versus State, 1921, as its case study to examine the extent to which Sicilians and other Italians problematize marriage and miscegenation laws in the South. So I'm going to be reading some excerpts from Chapter 2 about the lynchings of Sicilians and Italians, and I should also mention that I've crafted these moments that I'm about to read as narratives, with dialogue and with the hopes of offering a greater sense of space and place. But as a historian, it was important to me to only include details that I could verify within the source material, which for me was largely 19th century newspaper accounts. So even as I read these stories, I haven't actually taken liberties here. The details here were all found within the original source material. So I'm going to turn to the beginning now of Chapter 2. On the misty evening of October 15, 1890, while making his way home, Police Chief David Hennessy was gunned down in the streets of New Orleans. Hennessy's friend, Captain William O'Connor, responded to the shots fired and rushed to the chief as he lay bleeding in the street beneath a flickering street lamp. "Who gave it to you, Dave?" Hennessy replied, "Dagos did it." Lying in a hospital bed hours later, the popular 32-year-old police chief succumbed to his injuries. As a result of his declaration, local law enforcement rounded up dozens of suspicious characters throughout the city, including a Polish Jew and a Romanian, both of whom were released when they were discovered to be non-Italian. Eventually, 19 Italians were indicted and imprisoned, including a 14-year-old boy named Gasperi and a fool named Emanuele Polizzi. So by today's standards, Polizzi, I should mention, would be considered schizophrenic. The original source material referred to him as, quote, a fool. When the trial commenced the following February, a carriage containing the prisoners rumbled to the district courthouse each morning from the old parish prison. For nearly a month, 9 defendants charged as principals in Hennessy's assassination or accessories before the fact assembled before the courtroom where they were confronted by 60 prosecution witnesses and 80 defense witnesses. Finally, on March 13, 1891, the jury reached a verdict. Citing reasonable doubt and contradictory and insufficient evidence, the jury declared 6 of the defendants not guilty, including the fruit peddlers Antonio Bagnetto and Antonio Marchesi. Marchese's son Gasperi, wealthy and influential importer Joseph Maqueca, Maqueca's associate Charles Matrega, and laborer Bastian Incardona. The judge ruled a mistrial for the remaining three: Antonio Scafidi, a fruit peddler; Pietro Monasterio, a cobbler; and Polizzi, a street vendor. Almost immediately, the native-born white community in New Orleans unleashed accusations of bribery and jury tampering. Officially explained as a temporary measure, the court remanded the exonerated defendants back to the parish prison amid throngs of hissing New Orleanians who threw rocks at the passing carriage of prisoners. And I should mention here that it was really important for me to name the victims throughout this chapter, especially since these events have existed under the radar for so long. The next day, the following announcement headlined the Daily Picayune, Times Democrat, and New Delta. Quote, "Justice. Do the good people of New Orleans want it? All good citizens are invited to attend a mass meeting at Clay Statue to take steps to remedy the failure of justice in the Hennessy case. Come prepared for action." Far from being anonymous, the notice was signed by the Committee of 50, made up of some of the city's most well-known citizens and prominent business figures. As dawn broke, a mob of thousands assembled to answer the call. The young Democratic lawyer William Parkerson, perched on the pedestal of the Henry Clay statue, bellowed over the crowd, quote, "Murderers must be given their deserts. The jury has failed." Quote, "Kill the Italian," the horde chanted in retort. Following the rousing speeches, the amassed mob, brandishing Winchester rifles, made their way to the prison. Armed with a battering ram, they burst through the barricaded prison doors. They killed the Sicilians and any other Italians they could find, 11 in total, 6 of whom had already been acquitted or granted a mistrial. The remaining 5 had yet to have their day in court. The body of James Caruso was discovered with 42 bullet wounds. Antonio Marchese's wounds were not immediately fatal, but after being denied medical attention, he succumbed 9 hours later. The mob spared Gasperi, but dragged Bagnetto and Polizzi outside to be hanged and shot in front of the crowd. Parkerson dispatched the assembled, quote, "You have acted like men, now go home like men." At least some members of the mob made their way toward the Italian inhabitant Poydras Market, according to the Italian consul of New Orleans, the scene left behind at the prison, which was a butcherous massacre with, quote, "dead bodies hanged in trees." So this infamous 1891 lynching was not the only lynching of Sicilians and other Italians in the Gulf South during the late 19th and early 20th century. In fact, there were more than 24 Sicilians and other Italians who were lynched in the region between 1886 and 1910. So I'm going to turn to later in the chapter to a second lynching of 5 Sicilians in 1899 Madison Parish. Being Sicilian remained a causative factor in the violent events that transpired in Tallulah, Louisiana in 1899, where trouble began over a goat. The surrounding area of Madison Parish was home to several thousand African Americans, several hundred whites, and 6 Sicilians, 3 of whom were the DeFatta brothers. The popular and vivacious DeFatta brothers owned 2 grocery stores in Tallulah. Because of their financial success, certain members of the community regarded them with secret animosity. But otherwise, they often caroused with prominent community members, drinking and playing cards. Wednesday, the 19th of July, began like any other day. In the humid midday heat, a goat belonging to Francesco DeFatta wandered onto the property of Dr. J. Ford Hodge. It was not the first occasion that DeFatta's goats had trespassed on Hodge's estate, but having grown impatient from the repeated intrusion onto his balcony, on this particular sweltering day, Hodge drew his revolver and shot the interloping goat. The following day, Francesco, aggrieved for his goat, called to Hodge across his property. They quarreled, exchanging a barrage of animated words, but with no serious consequences. Less willing to dismiss the incident so easily, when DeFatta's brother Carlo encountered Hodge later that day, Carlo spoke harshly with Hodge. As the conversation grew increasingly heated, Carlo struck the doctor with his fist. Although Carlo was otherwise unarmed, Hodge drew and fired his revolver, grazing Carlo on the forehead. As Carlo collapsed, Hodge placed his boot on his chest, holding him to the ground. Giuseppe, the 3rd DeFatta brother, witnessed the fray from the gallery of their home. While Hodge worked to clear the chamber of his jammed revolver, boot still lodged on Carlo's chest, Giuseppe fired upon Hodge from the balcony with a pistol loaded with birdshot. Word spread swiftly through Madison Parish that the Italians had killed Dr. Hodge, and the three Barbata brothers were hastily arrested. The sheriff rounded up Giovanni Cerami and Rosario Fiducia, two Sicilian friends supposedly in cahoots with the cold-blooded foreigners, the Barbata brothers, on charges of conspiracy. Within hours, hysteria over Hodge's shooting enveloped the parish. Disquieting murmurs and anxious broadcasts reported that in an act of premeditated homicide, Hodge had been shot 50 to 75 times. With the 5 Sicilians confined in the parish jail, a crowd, quote, intoxicated with blood, multiplied outside. After constructing makeshift gallows from a device used to hoist dead cattle for skinning, the throng stormed the jail. They first dragged out Carlo and Giuseppe, then Francesco and Rosario, and finally Giovanni, making 3 separate trips from the jail to the swine slaughterhouse. In 3 separate acts, the frenzied mob lynched 5 Sicilians to enact, quote, vengeance upon the guilty, and to, quote, teach the Italian and his gang a lesson. The Weekly Messenger went on to describe the shooting of Hodge, not the lynching, as the tragic and dastardly event. Meanwhile, Dr. Hodge survived the shooting and was declared out of all danger 3 days later. So just to be clear, these 5 Sicilians were lynched for the murder of Dr. Hodge, who in fact survived the shooting. So what I find particularly noteworthy about these events is the post-lynching aftermaths. The discourse that the press employs, the diplomatic crises that ensues, which we can talk more about during the Q&A, but I want to turn now to talk briefly about the language that's being used in the aftermath of these lynchings. Post-lynching press accounts employed an unequivocally racialized discourse, which affords the impression that Sicilians and other Italians were lynched because of their racial ambiguity. Though true that Sicilians and other Italians were at risk for being lynched because of their race and ethnicity, evidence of such prejudice and racialized stereotypes has obscured other instrumental factors. So what I mean here is that Italians were lynchable because they were Italian, but they weren't lynched because they were Italian. And I mean that their Italianness meant that they could be lynched, but it's really the particulars of each of these lynchings that resulted from specific time and place contextual factors. So the various lynchings of Sicilians and other Italians, in spite of the particularities of each incident, resulted from a continuity of causes, such as economic and political competition. In the aftermath of the violence, community members employed race to defend the killings in racial terms, even if race was only tangentially related to the conditions that instigated the lynching. For instance, the dispute that unfolded between Dr. Hodge and the well-liked, well-embedded, long-term Tallulah resident Barbatas was not explicitly economically motivated. And I should mention that one of the theories offered for why non-Black individuals were lynched was that they were outsiders. But we can't actually assume that non-native born individuals were automatically outsiders, especially Italians in Louisiana. In fact, the Barbatas had lived in Tallulah for something like 6 years, while Dr. Hodge had only resided there for 2. Dr. Hodge was not in any sort of direct commercial competition with the Barbata brothers' successful grocery stores, nor did he shoot Francesco's goat because of fiscal resentment. Still, even though Dr. Hodge's wounds were not in fact life-threatening and he made a full recovery within days, local townspeople were exceedingly quick to form a lynch mob. Parish residents took the Hodge and Barbata dispute as an opportunity to dispose of the Italians who had lived in their midst. The fact that certain members of the community subsequently ordered the expulsion of the remaining Italians from the parish following the lynchings intimates that the mob's instigators held pre-existing views about the local Sicilians as economic competitors. Wanting to get rid of Italians, they used Hodge's shooting to do just that. In the meantime, the press protested that, quote, the same punishment would have been vented upon any set of men, no matter whether they were Italians, Englishmen, Germans, or natives of the United States, but ultimately justified the lynching in explicitly racial terms. The Times-Democrat entitled their piece, quote, Citizens plead necessity for white supremacy, and defended the lynching on the grounds that it was necessary for white supremacy. The native-born white community in Tallulah felt obliged to commit the lynching, since the, quote, complicity in the conspiracy could never have been proved illegally, and that to ensure white supremacy, no other course was possible than the course pursued. The Times went on to explain that of the several lynchings in Madison Parish in the past 18 months, quote, the result is that Madison Parish is never the sentinel of any race troubles. The Negroes have come to the realization of the fact that lawlessness on their part will not be tolerated. So the explicit awareness that the lynchings of these 5 Sicilians contributed to a culture of fear and coerced compliance from the, quote, Negro community and functioned to reduce Italians to the position of non-whites. Suggesting that white supremacy would otherwise be in jeopardy and identifying the reasons for the lynching of these 5 Sicilians as comparable with the motives behind the lynchings of African Americans indicates that Italians could be, when necessary, consigned outside a larger category of whiteness. Relegating Italians to a position outside of whiteness, which confirmed their racial transiency, presented a popular means to validate the lynching and to ensure the legitimacy of violence that would otherwise undermine white and nativist respectability. Ultimately, this process of racializing Italians was an after effect of the violence rather than its cause. And I do want to pause and just define that term racial transiency without getting too much into it. Scholars talk about Italians as being in between white and black, while others have considered Italians white on arrival, meaning that legally, because they could naturalize as US citizens, Italians were white. I introduced this idea of racial transiency because I see Italians in the South moving and being moved back and forth across the color line, which is why they could be lynched in order to protect white supremacy, but also be considered foreign white voters. So what I ultimately found here, Italians weren't necessarily lynched because of a racial animosity, but race was used to justify the lynching violence. The language of race was used to validate violence. So I want to turn to the epilogue here because this last part really drives home what I see as the so what and the contemporary significance of my research. On April 12, 2019, New Orleans Mayor LaToya Cantrell issued a formal apology for the lynching of the 11 Italians in New Orleans in 1891. The scene, Italian and American flags in view behind the podium where Cantrell spoke, the performance of both the American and Italian national anthems alongside a memorial wall dedicated to notable Louisiana Italians, bore little resemblance to the decades when Italians were considered a, quote, colony of vicious murderers and assassins, and, quote, degenerate monsters. Likewise, the lynching era, the culture of fear and vigilante violence exerted upon all persons of color seemed far removed. Cantrell's words were heartfelt and earnest. Quote, at this late date, we cannot give justice, but we can be intentional and deliberate about what we do going forward. I'm here today because I have a responsibility to speak honestly about the challenges we face, those that shape our history, and more importantly, our future. I ask you to continue to stand with me against anti-immigrant violence, against division, and for the idea that we have a responsibility to be the kind of people that our children are not apologizing for 128 years from now. Cantrell's poignant and cautionary reminder bears witness to the enduring implications of political campaigns waged upon the basis of intolerance, bigotry, and thinly veiled white supremacy. Well into the 21st century, current political conditions have facilitated an emboldened resurgence of nativist agendas that replicate the xenophobic strains of purportedly bygone eras. 1850s know-nothingism, 1880s Chinese exclusion, the 1920s quota regime. Just as 19th century scripts justified lynching violence and created an environment that validated such enmity, we must reckon with the lasting consequences of ongoing anti-immigrant oratory and policy. Within both historical and contemporary contestations over citizenship, the experience of Sicilians and other Italians in the Jim Crow Gulf South reminds us of the extent to which the language and discourse of race can manipulate, and offers a portent or forewarning about our responsibility to our future. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I am going to go ahead and open the floor now for questions and navigate any technical issues we might be experiencing. Let's see if I'll scroll these to see if we have any questions. So did other immigrant groups to the Gulf South face a similarly complex racialization process? What made the Sicilians and Italians unusual in terms of the suspicion they faced? I would say part of this has to do with the number of Sicilians and Southern Italians that are in the Gulf South at this time. There's actually, in the 1870s, more Italians in New Orleans and Louisiana than there are in New York. So there's this. So part of the reason they're experiencing this sort of suspicion and facing this complex racialization process is that there is this large population of Sicilians and Italians who have migrated here. Many of them are migrating seasonally, so they're just coming temporarily. And in the South, this is actually not especially suspect. This was actually seen as a welcomed sort of seasonal migrant, the fact that these populations were not necessarily staying. And we'll start to see the racialization become more complicated as these migrants start to set up roots and bring over their families and naturalize as U.S. citizens. They initially started working as laborers in the agricultural regions, and eventually they started opening up fruit vending stands, markets. Also, initially, those endeavors, commercial endeavors, are happening in communities of color. So they're not posing a direct commercial competition in these early stages for commercial competition for white native-born Southerners. So again, part of the suspicion that they're facing is the fact that there is just this large population that has arrived. And again, they're recruited, they're invited to be here to post-emancipation. But there's definitely going to be different layers of that suspicion from other native-born white laborers versus the business owners, employers who have recruited them. So yes, Christina Rodriguez mentions that insisting on naming the victims and the bringing these stories into the light. 2 questions. Narrative style is so engaging. Is there a broader tradition in U.S. history of combining source documents and narrative this way? Are there other historians writing in this style? Okay, that's an interesting question. Part of this was definitely part of a rewrite. So the idea was, how can we bring this story more to light? I think there are historians that are doing narrative history really well. Jill Lepore comes to mind with New York Burning. But I think part of this has to do with history is story. So how can we craft these, how can we craft our work, our research to lend itself to maybe a broader audience, or to at least lend itself to this more storytelling idea. And so part of my challenge in my rewriting was, okay, how do I bring this time and space alive when, people aren't writing in their newspapers about what it smelled like or what the lighting looked like, but how can I still gather those details to create something that's richer, that we can essentially feel a little bit more and have these stories come more to life. And in terms of this coming from my dissertation, my next project, what actually was really interesting, at the end of last year, so Christina Rodriguez asked, what am I working on for my next project? There's 2 things. I now am in Colorado, so I'm an assistant professor at Colorado State University. So I am doing some work on Italians here in Colorado, since there were actually 2 that I've been looking at so far, 2 major lynchings of Italians around the same time period. but the racial structure in Colorado is very different than Louisiana. So it's going to be a different story, but I am starting to scratch the surface of looking at essentially comparing and contrasting these different lynchings that are happening around the same time. The second project actually came out of this book. I was actually contacted by a gentleman who wrote an email to me and said, my great-great-grandfather is one of the lynching victims in your book, in your research, Giuseppe Venturella. And so we actually had a really interesting conversation last fall, and it struck me about one of the things that he mentioned to me was that, so I haven't mentioned this in the presentation yet, but in the post-lynching diplomatic issue that ensues after each of the lynchings is that there's existing treaty rights between Italy and the United States. Italy then, after these lynching, basically demands indemnity payments for the wrongful death of their citizens, of their subjects rather. And we see year-long debates ensuing whereby determining whether the victims were in fact U.S. citizens, whether they had naturalized to become U.S. citizens, or if they were still Italian subjects. And those that were determined to be Italian subjects, the United States ends up making payments to the Italian government, indemnity payments. And this relative of Giuseppe Venturella, who was a lynching victim in Hahnville in 1896, Hahnville, Louisiana, he explained to me that it was that money, that indemnity payments, that enabled his family to, the wife of Giuseppe Venturella, to immigrate to the United States and bring their children to the United States. So it struck me that doing some research on memory and the legacy of the descendants of these lynching victims, these Italian lynching victims, is going to be a sort of a fruitful a project that I'm hoping to start pursuing, to do some oral histories on what it means to be descended from these legacies. So Kim Selinsky asks, what were some of the biggest challenges in the research process for this book? Oh my goodness. Part of it is honestly the source material. So how do we find these? It was also really important for me to try to gather information from the actual Italians themselves, these actual migrants, and where do we find that material? The Italian language newspapers of Louisiana have not been preserved to a large degree, and so a lot of what I end up, in addition to 19th century newspapers being the major source for which are very rich in details, but my major source for these stories was actually diplomatic correspondence. And so I did research in Rome, in the archives of the sort of the Italian side of things, as well as the diplomatic correspondence that here in the US, where these ambassadors and diplomats are writing letters back and forth after these incidents, and especially in terms of how they're defining and debating citizenship. But in terms of trying to find where all of these little details are, that ends up being this major challenge, especially when we're looking at events that have, again, not really been covered. So now I've definitely seen there is a great deal that has been written on the 1891 lynching, to the point that we actually had this official apology just last year, issued in 2019. But a lot of these other lynchings, there's just tiny excerpts or tiny snippets, and how do we find more to actually build out the story? So that definitely was one of those big challenges for me. Question from LSU Press: what were the purpose of the indemnity payments? Do those still exist? That's a good question. In terms of whether these payments still exist, I would doubt that, but the purpose was basically to make amends for violating the treaty rights. The fact that they had this established treaty that in order to basically make this a safe place for the Italian state to send immigrants, and these immigrants were needed in the South to perform labor. So in order to basically keep those diplomatic and immigrant channels open, the indemnity payments are basically made to smooth the diplomatic crisis there. After the 1891 incident, things get so heated that the ambassador, the Italian ambassador in New Orleans, is recalled to Italy. Vice versa, uh, the U.S. ambassador in Italy is recalled. There is some threat that Italy is maybe going to send a warship to New Orleans to protect the immigrants, and the U.S. and Italy sever diplomatic ties for an entire year until the U.S. makes these payments um, to basically apologize for the wrongful death of Italian subjects. So another question Laura asked, was there anything interesting you found in your research that maybe did not end up in the book? Um, that is an interesting question. Definitely the sort of what happens with regards to these indemnity payments and the fact that that story I mentioned about the family of the lynching victims being able to come over to the United States as a result of these payments being made. That didn't end up making it into the book, but that that to me is a really huge detail. This idea that the lynching could result in indemnity payments, and then those payments are what enables this family to then immigrate to the United States. So we'll see if I'll leave it open for a few more moments to see if there's any other questions or comments. Well, I want to thank you all for being here. Don't forget to head over to LSU Press's website to pick up your own copy of Dixie's Italians. I believe they have a 40% off discount code. But again, thank you all for being here. It was a pleasure to talk with you about my book. Feel free to, I will type in my email address here actually in case there are any other questions that come up for you after we wrap up here. Thank you so much. Take care.